At Cross Purposes. A short story by Katharine Renell.
The year is 1899. Our story begins in the city of Oxford, where university student Jim Deering was in his college room trying to study for his imminent examinations.
Jim Deering was sitting in his rooms at Balliol College, Oxford, doing some rather heavy reading, for exams were in near proximity and he was anxious to do well. From another room across the landing came the muffled and unmelodious sounds of someone strumming the refrain from a contemporary popular song on a piano with both pedals down. But out in the street, as if to make things worse, a barrel organ was playing jerkily another contemporary song, which he also found distasteful and which did not exactly harmonise with the piano. Jim, after many fruitless endeavours to concentrate his thoughts upon his work, relinquished the idea at last as hopeless, and putting the book down with a sigh, got up and mechanically took a pipe down out of a rack near the mantelpiece. At the same time, the door burst unceremoniously open, and a pair of mischievous blue eyes in a sunburnt face, surmounted by a head of tousled fair hair, peeped round the corner. Jim looked round, and then, seeing who the intruder was, put his pipe down with the same patient sigh that he had bestowed so recently on the book. He now saw that any chance of a quiet smoke or a read was over, for that morning at all events. "Come in, old man," he said. "Only shut the door. I can't stand the row that infernal piano is making. I wonder if Seymour knows that exams are on next week, and consequently at least a few of us must work." The fair head and the blue eyes now transformed into a tall young man, arrayed in the cool and comfortable, though slightly negligent costume of grey flannel trousers and a canvas shirt. He walked gracefully forward into the centre of the room and sank into the biggest armchair. "Hang exams!" he ejaculated cheerfully. "Something far more important is going to happen to me, at any rate. Jim?" "Yes, Teddy?" "My best girl's coming down to the Balliol ball," he continued. Jim wheeled round slowly from where he had been standing, with his back to the fireplace, and began to clean out the bowl of his pipe. Which one is that?" he asked, vaguely thinking of the crowd of cabinet photographs of burlesque actresses, music hall artistes, and fair female cousins, which lined Teddy Graham's walls. The cousins he had no particular objection to, but he hoped sincerely, for the sake of the honest friendship which he bore him, and also for the ancestral domains which were coming to his only son at Papa Graham's demise, that it was not one of the others. Teddy shifted his position slightly, by removing his feet from the floor to the table and clasping his hands behind his head. "Now, don't be nasty," he said laconically. "You know that there's only one girl in the whole of this wide and wicked world who is really in possession of my unworthy heart." "And she is?" asked Jim from the other side of the room. Teddy sighed gustily, as if the thought of the lady's charms were almost too much for his sensitive feelings. "Kitty Seymour," he revealed. Jim was standing with his back to his friend, facing the fireplace, and he was so engrossed with the cleaning process which was going on within the bowl of his pipe that even this tremendous piece of news did not make him turn round. Teddy, who evidently considered this as indifference and heartless, waxed impatient. "You can't ever have seen her, old man, or you wouldn't stand there looking like any graven image when I tell you that I love her. I know Seymour himself is an awful ass." "He certainly is, since he took to playing that piano," said Jim grimly. "But his sister, oh yes, ye God, she is the sweetest girl in the world," Jim suggested. "So were they all, in their turn." Teddy picked up a cushion which had fallen off the sofa and then shied it at Jim's head. "Don't be cynical, Jimmy. It doesn't suit your style of ugliness. Have you ever seen her?" "I saw her when she came down last year for the Apes." "Ah, yes, that's where I saw her too, and I was bowled over on the spot, clean gone, you know, almost before she'd looked at me. Girls with eyes like wet violets and hair the colour of marmalade shouldn't come down to Oxford. They upset a chap in his work. I took it rather badly, my love. Johnnies in books always moon about and write poetry and play lovelorn tunes on the piano. I couldn't do either, so I only lost my appetite and complexion and came out lower than usual in exams." Teddy paused for a moment and then, "The long and the short of the whole thing is, Jimmy, I simply found that I couldn't stand the suspense any longer and decided to propose to her at this ball." He paused again, as if expecting an answer, but Jim was still silent and continued the cleaning process in his pipe. Teddy went on again. "The worst of it is, Jim, I'm in a fearful fix. That's what I came to you about. My eldest sister's going to be married, and she's fixed the ceremony for the very day of our ball. It's just like a sister to go and do a silly thing like that. It's impossible for me to get back here that night. We live so far away, and I must be present at the wedding. You see, I'm her only brother, and she'd think it rather unkind if I didn't turn up, I suppose." Teddy broke off again and leant back in his chair, frowning rather heavily and looking the complete image of dejection. Jim laid his pipe down and came across to his side. "Couldn't you come back the next day and propose to Miss Seymour then?" he suggested. Teddy shook his curly head. "Couldn't get here in time, and she leaves the first thing the next morning. Seymour told me so himself. And the beastly part of the whole thing is, I'm going down at the end of this term and may never see her again. She'll get snapped up by somebody else." if I don't get a look in first. Oh. Teddy stretched his long legs out in front of him and groaned aloud at the awfulness of his plight. Jim racked his brains for a means of comforting the unhappy lover. "Can't you write to her?" he said at last. Teddy sat up in his chair and stared at him as if he thought he'd suddenly taken leave of his senses. "Right? My dear fellow, do recall to your mind some of the letters I have written to you, and then tell me as a candid friend if in spelling or legibility or literary style altogether you consider that one of them would be capable of conveying so delicate a matter as a proposal of marriage to a young lady." "Right? My dear old chap, I wonder you don't ask me to telephone it." Jim turned round again and took up his pipe. "I don't see what else you can do," he said dryly. Teddy lit a cigarette and watched the faint blue wreaths of smoke curling upwards towards the ceiling, just for a minute or so before he replied. "There's only one other course open," he said, "and that is for you to propose for me." "Good heavens!" said Jim. The pipe loosened from Jim's hands, fell with a sharp thud into the grate. Jim turned round slowly. His dark eyes flashed strangely, and his face had grown suddenly white. "Well, of all the outlandish ideas," he began. Teddy interrupted him with a delightful, seraphic smile. "Not at all outlandishly," he said affably, "but on the contrary, extremely cute. All you've got to do, Jimmy, is to ask Miss Seymour for one dance. You're always so absurdly bashful, you know. You can't expect a girl to dance with you if you don't ask her, can you? And then, when you get her to some secluded romantic spot, Teddy broke off, chuckling like a naughty schoolboy, and the rest of the sentence was left to an eloquent silence. Jim frowned. "It's ridiculous, absurd, and insulting to Kitty, to Miss Seymour, as it is embarrassing for me. I've never proposed to anyone in my life, Teddy." Teddy's chuckle had evolved into a loud, irreverent laugh. "No, that's just about it," said Teddy benignly. "You've never proposed to anybody in your life, and what's more, never will either, if you don't assert yourself a little more and display more courage and camaraderie towards the fair sex than hitherto you—" "I can't help it, Teddy. I'm not like you know, who don't mind proposing to every girl you meet. I always was shy and awkward with women. Nobody wishes more than I do that I could get over it, but I can't. And as to proposing to Miss Seymour, why, I shouldn't know what to say." He was interrupted by Teddy from his chair, and placing both hands on his shoulders, he said, "My dear old chap, you're 24 years old, and the sooner you learn what to say to a girl when you want to propose to her, the better, I think. Anyway, you've got to propose to her next week. We've been chums ever since. We were little chaps at school, Jimmy, and I don't think you've ever refused me a favour yet." Jim looked up into the handsome, eager young face bending over him, the face of the friend he loved. "You've never asked me to do anything harder, Teddy," he said rather feebly, but he did not protest any further. His great love for Teddy had, as usual, proved stronger than his own will. The night of the ball. Jim looked across the crowded ballroom at the beautiful Miss Seymour and wondered how his allotted task could be performed. Taking a deep breath, throwing out his chest, he walked across towards the young lady in question. Having announced himself to the young lady, Jim touched the programme that was dangling at the end of Miss Seymour's white feather fan. "May I have the pleasure?" he said humbly. His opinion of himself had always been a singularly modest one. The girl raised a pair of lovely, shining eyes and smiled encouragingly. She held out her programme towards him, and Jim bent over it. "Thanks so much," said Jim. "May I have number 15? It is a waltz, is it not?" "Thank you so much," he repeated nervously. He scribbled his initials opposite the dance rather hastily, and then, with a courteous bow, walked swiftly away. And Miss Seymour looked after him with a half-surprised, half-wistful expression in her eyes. He had only taken one dance after all, although she had more disengaged ones on her programme, and yet he had seemed to enjoy her company so much last year, when she came down for the eights, that she must have been mistaken in him. He did not care. Miss Seymour, I hope I'm not too late. You can spare me a dance, I trust," said another admirer. She turned to greet this other would-be partner, but without the encouraging smile that had been bestowed on Jim, and a moment later was whirled away in the mazes of the first waltz. She caught more than one glimpse of Jim during the dances which ensued before number 15, and noticed that he was not dancing much, but was generally to be seen lounging, in a manner quite unusual to him, in doorways or corners. He looked pale too, she thought, and once a partner drew her attention to him and said that Deering had been working too hard recently, was bound to knock himself up if he went on much longer. She began to think. The girl's ready sympathy was aroused, for she had always been interested in the grave, rather reserved young undergraduate who her brother told her was so clever, but spoilt everything with his incorrigible shyness, and when Jim came up to claim his dance, she had greeted him with the lovely radiant smile which had already committed havoc with more than one undergraduate's susceptible heart. It seemed like an age passed, but eventually dance number 15 came up on the card. And there they were together. Jim held out his arms silently, and the girl, conscious of a slight feeling of disappointment that he did not seem to care more about dancing with her than just number 15, took it without a word, and together they passed into the ballroom. They had not gone for 2 turns around the room when Jim suddenly stopped and looked into her eyes. "Miss Seymour," he said, "don't think me awfully rude, but would you mind sitting this dance out, please? I've got something rather important to say to you." The girl glanced up at him with rather a surprised expression in her eyes. She noticed that his face was still rather pale, and that the dark eyes gazing so earnestly into her own were burning with a strange light. Her heart began to beat a little quickly, although she did not know then the reason why.
"Certainly."
She answered courteously, and Jim, without another word, led her away from the ballroom. In a secluded corner they spoke. It's a message," he began nervously, when a moment later they were established in 2 chairs in a secluded, sitting-out corner. "From Teddy Graham. You know him, don't you?" Miss Seymour smiled.
"It would be difficult to know you without knowing Mr. Graham as well. My brother always calls you Jonathan and David."
Jim did not smile. He was fidgeting rather nervously with the button of his glove. "Yes, we are chums," he said simply. Then suddenly turning in his chair and fixing his deep eyes on her face, "It's about Teddy that I want to speak to you tonight," he said. "He was so awfully sorry not to be able to come to this dance, but he was obliged to go home. He wanted to see you, particularly, Miss Seymour." The girl was beginning to look rather puzzled, but her lips were still parted in their polite, conventional smile.
"Yes,"
she said gently. For a moment Jim was silent, inwardly cursing Teddy for placing him in such an embarrassing position. Then suddenly he got up from his chair and stood in front of her, looking down into her face. "I can't imagine what you will think of me," he said, "but Teddy made me do it. On my honour he did, and he knows, the young beggar, that I never refused him anything in his life." Jim paused, and a damp perspiration began to break out on his brow. By this time, the absent Teddy was mentally consigned to the lower regions. Nothing was too bad, reflected the miserable Jim, for the person who could place him in such a hole as this. He looked at the girl again and saw that the perplexed expression on her face had deepened, though she was still politely smiling and trying to appear interested.
"Yes?"
she said. Jim sat down again in his chair and bent towards her. There was a look of determination on his white face. The shyness which had always been such a characteristic of him was for the moment utterly banished. He who, for himself, was almost cowardly, could, for another's sake, be bold. "Miss Seymour," he said gravely, "Teddy sent a message to you, and the message was this." He bent a little nearer and almost unconsciously took her hand. "Miss Seymour," he said, "I am Teddy's friend, and therefore, perhaps, What from another man would seem a grave insult may not seem so from me. The long and short of the whole thing is, he paused, Teddy loves you. Teddy loves you. And he wants to know if you will marry him. The hand which was within his suddenly grew cold as ice, then as suddenly was dragged away, and Jim reflected miserably that his very touch had grown repulsive to her. He dropped his eyes shamefacedly to the ground, and when at last he raised them, he saw that the girl had risen and was standing in front of him, looking down at him with an expression in her eyes which he had never seen before. Almost instinctively, he rose too and held out both hands towards her. Forgive me, he said humbly. Forgive me if I have insulted you. I only did it for Teddy's sake. She was silent for a moment. Then, as if acting on a sudden impulse, she laid both hands in his.
It was noble of you, not insulting. But I am only so sorry that it should have happened. I can never marry Mr. Graham.
She broke off, and her hands, taken away from Jim's, hung down limply by her sides. He came a step forward, astonishment on his face. Not marry him? He gasped, thinking of Teddy's handsome, captivating person, his general popularity with the ladies, and above all, of the noble income which was always his. Not marry Graham? He gasped once more.
No, I do not love him.
Jim was still incredulous. Oh, you cannot mean what you say, he pleaded, heart-rending visions of tears in Teddy's blue eyes, of that sunny head bowed with grief, and of a broken heart rising before his mental gaze. I can't tell Teddy this. It will break his heart. Surely, Miss Seymour, there is some other reason.
There is another reason.
Jim was close up to her now, and suddenly she raised her head and looked him full in the face. As she did so, their eyes met, and in that momentary flash, his soul saw clearly what was in hers. And he pleaded no more, but with a lack of courtesy, which was unusual with him, turned from her and walked swiftly away. And when a second later Miss Seymour's next partner came to claim her, he wondered what on earth Daring had been saying to fill those violet eyes with tears. It was about 5 o'clock on the following afternoon when Teddy Graham strolled leisurely into Jim Daring's rooms and sat down gracefully on the edge of the table. "Come out of that, you fossilised old idiot," he remarked affably, alluding to a weighty and awe-inspiring volume in which the owner of the room was at that moment buried. "Drop classics for once, for heaven's sake, and let's talk about something sociable. How did you get on last night? That's what I want to know." One naturally displays some slight curiosity over one's love affairs. Jim laid the book down and looked up at his friend with very anxious, haggard eyes. I'm awfully sorry, old chap, he said gently, but I'm afraid I haven't good news. Perhaps you'd better see her about it, Teddy. I always was a stupid fool over that kind of thing, and I dare say I've blundered. She refused me then, said his friend. Jim turned his head away. He feared to meet the sorrow which he felt was rising up in those happy blue eyes. But Teddy did not indulge in any violent outbursts of grief, but sat so still and quiet that Jim grew frightened and feared that the blow which he had just struck had hit harder than even he had expected. I'm afraid that's about it, he said sadly. Another silence. Then, does she love anyone else? Came a queer, choked voice from the table. Jim's head was turned still further away. Yes, she does. Do you know who he is? Again, in that muffled undertone. Jim's hitherto white face flushed, suddenly scarlet. He did not reply. His friend looked and said, Because if you don't, I do. Jim turned round sharply. There was Teddy, idling on the table, with his straw hat tipped over his eyes, shaking with suppressed laughter. Good heavens, the muffled voice then had not been the outcome of grief, but of this unseemingly mirth. Jim sprang up from his chair. Look here, Teddy, he cried sternly. I'm at a loss to understand what all this means. Why that... Teddy interrupted him feebly. You jolly old juggins, he said weakly, when his laughter would allow him to speak. Can't you see yet what I've seen all along and have known for the last year? Don't you know that you are the man she loves? Then you've been making fools of us both, he said rather hotly. Teddy continued, and it's not me at all. Why, she never loved me, and I never thought about her, except that she was the prettiest girl I ever saw. But Jim sank into his chair again. Then you knew that I cared for her? He questioned. Teddy relapsed into another fit of laughter. Knew it? He said after the necessary interval. Bless you, Jimmy. Trust me for finding things out. Oh, yes, I knew it, and I knew something else too, just as well. What was that? Interrupted Jim, still fuming. Why, though you're safe for a first class in most things, in a simple matter like this, you're about as big a duffer as ever was born. You've got no gumption in you, Jim. No go. You ought to have more conceit. Why do you think that if I hadn't made you propose to Miss Seymour, you would ever have got up to the scratch at all? Of course not. You'd have gone on like this for years, making yourself miserable, and her too, just because your own opinion of yourself is such a wretched one that you don't like to offer yourself to any girl. I never thought that she could possibly care for me, said Jim humbly. No, of course not. And you would never have found that out either if I hadn't made you propose to me. Oh, What a joke that was. Here there was another necessary interval before he continued. It nearly killed me to think of a shy old chap like you proposing to another man's girl. You wouldn't have done it for yourself. Wild horses wouldn't have made you. But you did it for me. That just shows what a generous chap you are. But I knew, when I told her that I wanted to marry her, she'd let out her secret, and it appears she did. Let me congratulate you, old fellow. Jim got up out of his chair. Stop, he said. Not quite so quickly, Teddy. What about your sister's wedding? Was that all a hoax, too? Teddy was twisting himself up into knots. Oh, you old mug, of course it was. If you hadn't been so wrapped up in thinking of Miss Seymour, you would have remembered that my oldest sister is only 15. Rather young for that kind of thing, you know. They've decided to postpone that ceremony. Jim passed his hand across his brow, the haggard look that had faded from his face, and left one of conscious but rather bewildered happiness. I can hardly believe it, he said in a dazed voice. It seems that instead of having done you a good turn, you've done one for me. The best one I ever had yet, Teddy. Anyhow, I'm awfully grateful to you, for I found out last night what I should have never known anyhow else, that Kitty, God bless her, loves me. But somehow that doesn't seem to have brought matters any further. She still doesn't know that I love her. With that, Teddy slid down off the table and placed both hands on Jim's shoulders. Then go and enlighten her, Jimmy. Go to her like a man. You know your answer already. Surely you aren't afraid, said Teddy. The pallor of Jim's face flushed to a shamed red. I can't do it, Teddy. I can't, I tell you. I never shirked anything in my life yet. But I'm in perfect terror of a girl, and she's got such a dear little frightened way of looking at a chap out of those lovely eyes of hers, that I'm afraid of hurting her. Proposing for the sake of obliging you, well, that was one thing. Proposing for myself is, well, quite another. Teddy's blue eyes flashed unutterable contempt. Then you're an absurd coward, he said scornfully. That's what you are. Go on and do it, Jim. You did it last night, and you can do it again. There, he was interrupted by his friend. But she's away, isn't she? No, said Teddy. That was another of my lies, only a necessary part of the hoax. She's staying until tomorrow and is at this very moment partaking of tea in Seymour's rooms. Saw her go in. Hark! He paused abruptly and stood with his head held high in a listening attitude. Down the passage, a door was heard to open, rather suddenly, and a man's voice called out. Derring, come over to my rooms, will you? Have tea. Teddy chuckled delightedly. You see, even Providence is interested in your case, he explained roundly. For here is everything being made smooth for you. Go in and have tea with Seymour at once, Jimmy. And afterwards, take Miss Seymour out on the river in a canoe. I say, dear, are you coming? Said the voice across the corridor. Jim looked despairingly into Teddy's face. I can't. He gasped. For answer, Teddy gripped his fingers into Jim's shoulders and, opening the door, ejected him forcefully into the passage. "Go on, you idiot! I tell you it's beastly rude not to." The voice, which before had been merely gently persuasive, now suddenly became loudly imperative. "Daring!" Then another voice, much softer and much more melodious, and in gentle though equally persuasive tones.
"Mr. Deering."
Forward, young lady," chuckled Teddy. But Jim did not hear him. He was striding towards Seymour's rooms as fast as his legs could carry him.